Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week of lectures. We're going to do the French and Indian Wars here. We'll talk about the Treaty of Paris, how it ends the French and Indian Wars, the British reorganization of the colonies. That means the American colonies in this context. We'll talk about some unpopular acts of King George III's ministers, mostly prime ministers, who were not super popular in the American colonies. We'll do a little colonial resistance and talk about some constitutional debates by the states, as it were. Now, where we're going to start is with what I'm calling the Second Hundred Years' War between Great Britain and France. The First Hundred Years' War, some of you might know about, is it happened in the 14th to 15th centuries between England and France. It had a lot to do with succession, and it was a series of smaller wars that became known as the Hundred Years' War, and it actually lasted 116 years. So that's kind of hilarious. But that one was made famous. You might have heard of Joan of Arc or the Black Prince from England. Those were some of the more famous combatants from the First Hundred Years' War. This one, sometimes it's called the Second Hundred Years' War because it's actually a series of world wars that Britain and France were involved in. And each of these, I don't want to call them mini wars, but mini wars in this Second Hundred Years' War has a worldwide name and then a name it was called in the Americas. It's just they're the same war. They're just called something different depending on where you are because the people involved are changed, the years, the dates they change. Sometimes so this first one, the 9 Years' War, last 1688 to 1697. In the Americas, it's called King William's War, and it started a year later here. The War of Spanish Succession is called in the Americas Queen Anne's War. It lasts. The dates are a little bit different there because it's a very complicated situation. The fighting is done in the Americas at different times than it was in Europe, especially. The War of Austrian Succession in the Americas is called King George's War, King George of England, even though it has to do with Austria. European monarchs are always sort of intertwined in their state of affairs and what they're trying to accomplish. So a lot of people get caught up, a lot of different countries get caught up in succession crises in places like Austria where the Habsburg dynasty is ruling. And then it finally brings us to the 7 Years' War, which we know better as the French and Indian War. So these are, when I'm terming the Second Hundred Years' War, you notice that the dates aren't exactly 100 years, but it's sort of a moniker, not so much an exact year count. Now I have a map that I'm going to show you that should illustrate that this is actually a world war. Most of these are worldwide worlds because of colonial involvement. At this time, most European powers are getting colonies around the world, mostly in the Americas and in some parts of Africa and even as far away as Asia. So see here the sort of the breakdown. So in blue, we have Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, with some minor allies. And then here, so Canada, northern Canada, is mostly British territory. These would be the American colonies where we live today. Brazil as a colony of Portugal. There's some, British Honduras is down here, some of these Caribbean islands. So these are Prussian colonies. They later become German East Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. So there's some minor territories in Asia too. On the other hand, we have in green France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden with some allies. So here's Russia and Sweden, which actually controls part of Finland at the time. And then you can see the European nations here. This blue part in the middle, that's Prussia. No, I'm sorry, I'm talking about Austria here. This green part here is Austria, some German confederated states because Germany's not unified yet. It's a very complicated time period in world history, but you can see that there are colonies all over the place. The Philippines here, which for a long time was a U.S. Protectorate after the Spanish-American War, much later was part of Spain's empire. And then you can see Mexico here, Florida still part of Spain. Here, this is New France, the Louisiana Territory. It extends all the way up to Quebec and some parts of Newfoundland. So it really is a worldwide war is what I'm trying to say. And we'll come back to this map just so we can see sort of what's going on in the North American colonies. And remember that this map here does not include most Indian tribes because there aren't French people living in this entire purpley area. There are an awful lot more Indian tribes than there are French people living there. Same with the Spanish areas. The shaded green areas, those are heavily populated by European English settlers. while these stripy areas are sort of half and half, a lot of Indian tribes still living in these areas too. Down to the French and Indian War, if this was a regular one, I'll say, well, who is this guy? And you'd be like, oh, is it George Washington? I'd be like, yeah, it's Major George Washington. He's not a general yet during the French and Indian War. It's actually part of 2 unsuccessful attempts to remove the French from Fort Duquesne. And you say, well, where's Fort Duquesne? It's right here on the map. So just sort of in what is today Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania-Ohio area. So he is a big player in the French and Indian War. He's sort of one of the more famous British officers who comes out of the French and Indian War. You'll notice that he's wearing this red uniform with the blue jacket. The blue jacket isn't that significant, but the red uniform should signify that he is a British officer. At this point, he was supposed to allow the French. He was supposed to get the French to allow Virginia to set up a fort around Fort Duquesne, and they said no. So the French were worried about that and sent out a little contingent, a little army force. And what George Washington ends up doing is he set up a fallback point, this tiny little fort that he called Fort Necessity, obviously named because it was a necessary fort to stave off the French. So Washington ends up losing, and he surrendered to the French at Fort Necessity. He signed a treaty, but he couldn't read French, so later down the road he said he didn't understand what he signed, and he got out of, at least from a British perspective, he got out of the obligations of that little treaty. So we have here a modern reconstruction of what Fort Necessity looked like, and it looks a little ragged even in the modern reconstruction, and it's pretty much just a pile of sticks and logs to do what it can. And you can see how easily this could be overrun. I mean, we could overrun it with, you know, rocks and stuff today. But here is just sort of a zoomed in map. So here's Fort Duquesne, and then Fort Necessity a little bit south of the border down there near modern day. It's in modern day West Virginia. So that's just sort of the geography of it. This, though, as part of bringing up historical myths, this is the famous Last of the Mohicans movie you might have heard of with Daniel Day-Lewis as one of these Mohicans. This is where they get involved, so if anybody's wondering the historical context of that movie, it comes from this time period. And just back to this map to show you some of the major movements during the French and Indian War. There's a lot of fighting that goes on here, and as the name suggests, there are a lot of Indian tribes involved on both sides of this colonial war. And so you can see some territories. So there's disputed territory in the green area. British territory is this sort of brown, French in this pink color. So there is a little bit of back and forth during the war, and a major outcome is that we get the Treaty of Paris. Paris is the capital of France. This is where the treaty is signed. But the French end up losing this war, and they lose all of their North American colonies, but eventually are given back sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean. And we're looking here, that would be mostly in Saint Dominique and Martinique down here. So for the most part, they lose most of their North American territory, though, even though they don't, you know, control a lot of it. I can't stress enough that there are tons of Indians living in these areas at this point in history. But they do lose. They sign the Treaty of Paris, but they're allowed these sugar-producing colonies because to avoid monopoly by the British, it was a Spanish condition. So as part of the Treaty of Paris, one of the provisions is that the British decide that American colonists cannot go beyond what we're going to call the Proclamation Line of 1763 in this red line down here. There were a lot of colonists venturing out there, and part of the causes of the war have to do with colonists running into Indians in what is labeled here as Indian country. So the King of England and his ministers decide that the colonists shouldn't have access to these western lands so they can avoid any more war with Native Americans. This really makes a lot of colonists mad because they wanted the land out west. They were, you know, nobody was really thrilled with Indians being in the way, so they try to get around them. But this proclamation line establishes the frontier. It says that colonists cannot go further than that line, and it wasn't like somebody put some string up to say you can't cross this line. It was labeled on maps more than anything. But it doesn't actually stop any migration at all because it can't be enforced. There just aren't enough British soldiers in the American colonies to enforce it. So we get a lot of settlers, who just go on pass the line anyway. And that's what this map here is trying to illustrate. The detachments, the companies, the battalions of British soldiers in North America by 1763. So a battalion is about 350 men in these bigger circles in New York and some places up here in what was French territory have these large battalions of British soldiers, and then there's smaller detachments sort of scattered around, but it's just not enough to enforce the line, which would run roughly where the cursor is going right here. It's unenforceable. It's a long way to say it's unenforceable. And so as part of the cost of this war, a lot of the war in the French and Indian War was because of Americans, not British Americans, colonial British subjects living in the Americas, coming to blows with French colonists further than that line and Indians further than that line. Anyway, it costs a lot of money for the British to fight in North America because they still also have a war going on in Europe and elsewhere. So, as part of this, the British government feels that the American colonists should have to pay their fair share of it. And to explain that in part, we have to talk about British monarchs for a second. Now, King George I and King George II were from Germany. They never really learned how to speak English, but they become the kings of England because monarchies are weird like that sometime. I encourage you to bring it up in the weekly questions, and we can talk about it at a little bit more length. So they let their ministers do a lot. So there's a sort of growing tradition in Britain through 1763 about prime ministers or just interior ministers, ministers of the British government in general, doing the work of controlling the colonies. But by the time we get to King George III, he wants to be a little bit more hands-on, and he handpicks this one particular minister, this guy named George Grenville, name up here. So he handpicks this minister, George Grenville, to enact some of these acts. And George III really wants the colonies to start paying for their war. So a way to do that, George Grenville comes up with in 1764, it's a year after the war, the Sugar Act, and this act is designed to collect trade duties, and that just means sort of taxes on foreign molasses and to toughen other trading regulations. On molasses, it's a sweetener. It's about keeping things sweet. Sugar and other sweeteners are really popular in Europe because European drinks are not very sweet. They're not very sweet at all. A year later, we get the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is actually unprecedented legislation to this point, and it taxes the colonies directly in a way that they hadn't been before. It is heavily resisted through crowd actions and the boycotting of British trade goods in the American colonies. And this is the one that really makes them mad because paper is taxed. So what ends up happening is that the newspapers start criticizing Prime Minister George Grenville at this point. We also have the Quartering Act this year, and that puts the financial burden of housing, I say imperial troops on the PowerPoint. These imperial troops are British soldiers. So it puts that financial burden on the Americans. And if you notice in our Bill of Rights, our modern Bill of Rights, there's something that addresses this directly. The Third Amendment says that the U.S. government can't require citizens to house soldiers, and it's directly linked to this Quartering Act right here. Now, the Sugar Act doesn't really cause too much fuss in the colonies. Initially, it doesn't provoke any sort of public outcry. It's the Stamp Act, because that taxes pretty much all paper, and newspapers require paper to exist. So that's the one that really causes the public outcry. And what happens is that the colonies call their first actual body together in what's called the Stamp Act Congress of 1765. They call it in New York. 9 of the 13 American colonies send representatives, and they come up with this Declaration of Rights and Grievances of the Colonies that they send off to King George III. They're not trying to piss off the king. They say stuff like, your ministers are doing whatever. So they really try and post the blame on the ministers rather than the king himself. Because remember, King George I and II, they weren't too hands-on, so there's this tradition that the ministers are sort of running everything. But George III, he wants to be a little more hands-on. He handpicks George Grenville and says, do this. So it's actually him telling the minister what to do. The colonists don't really understand this at first, So they are saying it's your ministers doing this, and they're pretty sure that he just doesn't know. The king doesn't know that the minister is enacting these taxes. They are very deferential to the king um, during this time frame, and as of this Stamp Act Congress, they even here they build this statue of George III in Bowling Green to honor the king for hearing their grievances. So imagine having a statue built for you just because you heard somebody's grievances. It just doesn't happen today. Now we have to talk about citizenship for a second, because George III, King George III, and Prime Minister George Grenville, they viewed British citizens as different from British subjects. Now, the American colonists believed themselves as that they were equal subjects or equal citizens on the same status of any British citizen living back in England. Well, the king and prime minister did not view this the same way, and they saw them as just separate. So they were below British citizens because they were subjects. But we end up getting this wide-scale resistance, especially to this citizen versus subject debate. Resistance becomes actually really fierce, and the British government cannot collect taxes on the Stamp Act, so the king ends up firing George Grenville and puts William Pitt in charge as prime minister. And William Pitt is of Pittsburgh fame. He gets a city named after him where a football team exists. So William Pitt comes in to replace him, and the colonies think that that's pretty outrageous, that the king can just replace a minister because he was unable to collect on this tax. The king, for his part, ends up putting out this declaratory act, what's known as the Declaratory Act, stating that Britain can tax whatever it wants, which further enrages the British subjects living in the American colonies, North American colonies. But by 1766, the people are cool with the king, and they just see it as a series of poor ministers who are enacting these kind of crummy laws that they don't necessarily agree with. But just keep in mind that even up, through the beginning of the revolution, which we're about to get into, people are okay with the king. They don't blame the king because they think that he's on their side. They just think that it's these ministers who are the problem. Which brings us to our introduction to the American Revolution. We'll go over some American acts of resistance with the massacre, the Tea Party, and eventually into the Continental Congress. Excuse me. Then the war actually begins in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, which I'm sure you've heard of as good American citizens. We'll get through Bunker Hill, talk a little bit about the Continental Army, and then we'll, a year after 1775, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence and a little bit about common sense and Jefferson's drafts and revisions of the Declaration. And here I want to ask you a question that you can think about yourselves, or we can discuss it in the discussion forums. I want you to think about the American Revolution, about whether or not it was actually a revolution. Was this just a war to separate from Britain, or was it about leaving the empire, staying in the empire? Was it really a revolution at all? And this is a hotly debated topic in historiography, contemporary historiography, even today. So it's something that if we were like in an actual class setting, I would ask you right now. It's like, what do you think? Was this a war for independence? Was it a revolution, or something in between? And a lot of people say, well, something in between, because I don't give them enough time to think about it. But I want you to think about it and, really, like, is this a revolution in the same ilk as the French Revolution? If you've taken World Civ 2, you might know a little bit more about that. Or is this just a war for independence? And maybe I'll ask you about that later on. But as we're leading to it, let's talk about some strained relations between the British government and the American colonies. And we'll start here with some of these acts by the British governments. And the first one we'll go over here is the Townshend Revenue Act. And it looks like Townshend, but it's Townsend. And what this is, it included taxes on imported goods, including lead, paper, glass, tea, which are not direct taxes, but more traditional import taxes. So sort of like tariffs. We hear a lot about tariffs in the news today. And Americans end up organizing boycotts and secret societies to enforce these boycotts. This is one of the first of the acts that we'll go over leading up to the Revolution, past those earlier Stamp Acts and Sugar and Quartering Acts. As part of this, we get this American British subjects living in the American colonies, women supporting the boycott of British goods by producing clothes themselves instead of importing them, and pressuring other women to, or other women and men and children, I guess, to wear homespun, in air quotes, clothes, and denouncing silk, satins, and other imported luxuries. So they organized these spinning groups and called themselves the Daughters of Liberty. This later evolved into, you might have heard of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I think you can get a license plate if you're a daughter of the American Revolution today to describe that. But they would just, this was more about buying homegrown, or in this case, homespun items rather than importing them from Great Britain, which leads us to our next strained relation between the British government and the American colonies is the Boston Massacre. And what this was is a local crowd, it turned into a riot against the hated redcoats who were there to enforce the import of some of these goods that Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty were boycotting. And so this Boston Massacre ends up leading to the death of 5 British subjects living in the American colonies. There's propaganda that comes out of this from people like Paul Revere, who was a pressman. Now, this is Paul Revere's depiction of what he calls the bloody massacre perpetrated on King Street, and there's the date. And now you have to look at this, is this accurate or is it propaganda? There's this whole debate and actually a trial for the British soldiers who are involved with the massacre. What happens is actually in the Boston Massacre, there are people who were protesting in Boston. Boston always seems to be the seat of protest in the New England colonies or in the American colonies in general. And it turned into a riot, and so there's back and forth on both sides. Nobody is 100% sure how it happened, but the British colonists who were at the riots were throwing what they called snowballs, what the British soldiers there called ice balls, at the soldiers, and then we're not sure even today who says fire, but somebody gave the order to fire, so these British soldiers opened fire, and 5 people end up being killed. 5 Americans, it's not the United States yet, but 5 American subjects end up being killed. The first casualty of the revolution is actually an African American, this guy named Crispus Attucks. Here is the site of the Boston, I mean, it's a little bit modernized today, but this is the site of the Boston Massacre. So it ends up becoming the first martyrs of the American Revolution come out of the Boston Massacre, which actually takes place as far back, see on our date here, 1770. The actual fighting doesn't start for another 5 years, but they're considered the first martyrs of independence, Crispus Attucks being the first among them. Of all people, though, I want to tell you, there's a trial to determine who ordered to fire, and of all people, John Adams was the defense lawyer for the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre, and he ends up getting them off. There are people around Boston calling for them to be hung, but actually he argues that they were acting in self-defense, so they weren't prosecuted the way most colonists would have liked to be. And now our next strained relation is the Tea Act, and this is the big one. We're actually getting into I guess famous stuff that you've heard of with the Tea Act. And the Tea Act is what it sounds like. There's a tax on imported British tea, which actually comes from as far away as India, because British people love their tea, and British colonists are no different. And this sort of, just for some myth making, this is where the rift between Great Britain and the United States. In Great Britain, they drink tea. In the United States, we drink coffee more often. So this is part of it, because the Americans don't want to import tea anymore. The British are sort of forcing it on the American colonies, so they end up defying this plan to make tea, to market cheaper tea to America with the Townshend Duty Act, and we end up getting the Boston Tea Party, which highlights the resistance to this. And you guys, I'm sure, have heard of the Tea Party at least once in your lifetime. I don't know why that's there. So here's a famous image, later dubbed the Boston Tea Party, but at the time it's known as the destruction of tea at Boston Harbor. And it happens December 16, 1773. It's this group of American colonists who are disguised themselves as Indians. That's why they look like Indians in the painting here. And they end up destroying 3 shiploads of tea by throwing it into the water. Now, the reason this was such a big deal was actually, in reality, this was a way to make tea cheaper, sort of a bribe to the colonists from the East India Company, which is run by the British government, kinda. So the East India Company wanted to sell tea directly to the colonies, but they didn't. It ended up not working, and the colonials didn't like it because it sort of goes along with the principle of taxation without representation. Uh, Colonists decided that taxes to run the empire are okay, but not to make profit, and they saw this as a way for the East India Company to make profit. So that's sort of where this Boston Tea Party and resistance to the Tea Act come from. And just to put some numbers on it, just to put some numbers on it, the colonists end up dumping 10,000 pounds of tea into the water, and that took it a little too far. The Sons of Liberty thought people would buy the tea, so they wanted to destroy it because the tea was cheaper, and they didn't. But the Sons of Liberty weren't happy about it, so they are the ones who end up dumping it into the water, and that's when Britain really gets mad, and we start getting to this point of the Intolerable Acts. Hopefully, you've heard of the Intolerable Acts before. And the Intolerable Acts are designed specifically to break the will of the American colonists, which brings us to Thomas Hutchinson, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts until 1774. Now, this Royal Governor that means he's appointed by the King, and what he ends up doing after the Tea Party and other boycotts and protests by the American colonists is he flees to England by 1775 and becomes an advisor to King George III on problems in North America, specifically in New England. What ends up happening is that people end up ransacking his house after he left and taking all of his stuff. And Hutchinson was no fan of the American colonists. He was there appointed by the king himself. And when he gets back, he tells the king that this is a very delicate situation and the colonists are just unruly in general. So he was not a big fan of the American colonists pretty much at all. And what we want to say next is that King George goes through actually a few prime ministers leading up to the American Revolution, which is a series of prime ministers who he's not happy about. So he kicks out and he replaces them with somebody else. It's not how it works today, of course. But the situation, as advised by some of his advisors, like Tom Hutchinson and some of his new prime ministers, leads to, remember our map from earlier, where the British soldiers are being stationed around. Well, now, by this point, by 1775, we get 11 battalions of British soldiers stationed in Boston itself, in and around Boston, the Massachusetts area. You can see battalions elsewhere on the map too, but the most are in Boston because they are the big troublemakers here, especially. So here are some, as we're getting into the Intolerable Acts, we get the Coercive Acts of 1774, and what these Coercive Acts are is what the American colonists call the Intolerable Acts. Now, in the Coercive Acts, the port of Boston is closed by the British Crown. That means by the British government, and it makes various modifications in the Massachusetts government to install a new royal governor and some other minor changes. But these are the Intolerable Acts because now Boston can't participate in the world economy. We also get this year the Quebec Act, and this gives Ohio River Valley to Quebec and reorganizes the Quebec government on a French tradition and recognizes Catholicism, all of which are not very favorable to the American colonists. And here's just a map to show you. So here's Quebec, the Ohio River Valley would be this region down here, and that was given to the Quebec government. And that's significant because it's given away Western lands that the Americans would want to settle in, even though that proclamation line of 1763 still exists. Later in the year, we come to the First Continental Congress, where 12 colonies send representatives to Philadelphia to participate in this Continental Congress. I'd like any of you to tell me which colony isn't represented in this Continental Congress. That'd be kind of some fun homework to do. So this Continental Congress, where there's some of the things decided is that they get this Declaration of American Rights that they send to the British Crown. That means the King himself. When we're talking about the Crown, we're talking about the King. At this point, the American colonists are still in favor of the King. They still think that it's these ministers who are the big problem, and people like Thomas Hutchinson are reporting back to the King untrue things in general. So this is sort of the last straw, though, with the British Crown, because the King sort of takes it as a personal attack on himself this Continental Congress, where they're declaring the American rights, these British subjects' American rights, which inevitably leads to the war itself in April of 1775. The British had already blockaded Boston Harbor, so there's no way to get anything out of Boston, and they move into actually the Massachusetts countryside, the Bostonian countryside, if you will, and they meet the, I guess you'd call them the Minutemen, the Patriot forces at Lexington on April 19th, 1775, where there's actually a minor victory for the Americans, the colonial Americans at this point. So, and we also, there's on this map we have Battle of Concord is represented too. So these are the early engagements that I'm sure you've heard of at least once in your lifetime. And here we have this representation of the Battle of Lexington. The sketch was published shortly after the event, within a couple of weeks. You can see the sort of the Minutemen here, a little disorganized. The British soldiers lined up rather well in a good formation, and maybe some veterans could explain to the rest of us how important it is to stay in formation, especially when you're fighting in a situation like this. So here's actually the main routes. So once we get to Concord, there is a retreat from Concord, a rather lengthy retreat back to Boston itself for the British soldiers there. This is a representation. It looks like a photograph. It's not. It's just an illustration of the British retreating as far back as Boston itself. And the next major engagement after Lexington and Concord is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This one also, I think you might have heard of. The British want to also again drive out the radicals from some of these areas in Massachusetts, but they end up meeting bigger resistance than they thought they would. And it's at this point that the Continental Congress decides that it's time to raise an army. And here's a later representation, not that much later, about 11 years later. It's a rather patriotic, heroic representation of the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the Continental Congress decides it's time to raise an army, and John Hancock, who you recognize as having that big signature, I think there's a bank or something named after him today, wants to be in charge. But George Washington, who we remember from the French and Indian War and from our money, was also a candidate, and the Continental Congress decides to go with George Washington because they wanted Virginia to join in this revolution. It's not, it's about a revolution at this point. So they want Virginia to join, and they think by enlisting, I shouldn't have said enlisting, picking Washington to lead the army, that Virginia would certainly join, because at this time Virginia was the biggest colony. They have the most people and the most money. George Washington, I should say, is a Virginian. And so it's important to the Continental Congress to get George Washington to participate. So George Washington decides to participate, which brings us to the next Continental Congress, where we get the Declaration of Independence, which is adopted on July 2nd of 1776. We have this image in our heads of July 4th as the actual date, but that was sort of a later date given. The Declaration is adopted on the 2nd, and it's actually signed throughout the year, throughout the summer. There are delegates in and out signing the Declaration, but here's some of the language is the word I wanted there from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, so on and so on. But there's also some stuff that's left out that I wanted to show you guys, some omitted passages from about the evils of the slave trade. So I'll just read this one here. They're talking about King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. That means during the transportation, or here, during their transportation here. Determined to keep and open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his his veto power for suppressing every legislative attempt, there's a typo there, to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. And so this actually ends up being omitted because the southern colonies rely quite heavily on slavery for their economy and existence. So this is out of the Declaration. They didn't want to include it. Jefferson wanted to include it, but as part of the revision, even though he was a slave owner himself, he ends up taking out this passage to please the southern colonies. Some other stuff, other notables from the early part of the war is Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Now, Lord Dunmore, he is actually the Earl of Dunmore is his real title. He's the royal governor of Virginia, and he issues this declaration. It installs martial law in Virginia and promises to free all slaves who would join the British Army against the colonial rebellion after the war was over. So this is sort of an early manumission, widespread manumission project. A lot of slaves end up joining Lord Dunmore's army. Doesn't have a huge effect across the colonies, but it is one of these sort of bigger institutions to come out of the early part of the war. This image here, I don't want to say picture, depicts various soldiers as part of the Yorktown campaign. Now this would be a regular Continental soldier. This is what we might call a Minuteman with a fancy hat, who's not, well outfitted. Here's another regular soldier, and here's an image of an African American soldier. It looks sort of like a racist caricature, but none of these people are drawn very well in this photo. So in this map here, we can see sort of how divided the British colonies, the American colonies, are at the start of the Revolution. So when we say loyalist strongholds, that's sort of opposed to patriot strongholds. Loyalist means they're still loyal to the British governments, and you can see that New York City is a big one. Norfolk closer to us, Wilmington even closer to us. These port cities are actually pretty loyal to the British government. Contested areas out west here, New Jersey especially was a contested area. The Patriot areas are much bigger. You can see in this red color, and then Indians, loyalists, or neutral. That's pretty much everywhere else. This is mostly Indian territory out here. Here's some of the battling. I think we're going to go over the battle engagements a little bit more next week. Here's more battle engagements that we'll go over at greater length next week. And I think some of the imagery will wait until next week to go over it. So the war has begun, and we will finish it up next week. Appreciate you sticking with me, and I will see you in a week.